Savannah's late October heat clung to the city like a velvet drape, refusing to yield even after the conference gala at the DeSoto Hotel had spilled its last guests onto Liberty Street. Thaddeus Crane, cardiothoracic surgeon, founder of the Cranialis Heartworks chain, and keynote speaker whose remarks on CRISPR-assisted valve repair had earned a standing ovation, should have been upstairs in his suite, drafting grant proposal addenda while sipping the single ounce of rye he allowed himself on celebratory nights. Instead, driven by a restlessness he could neither diagnose nor medicate, he wandered south toward Forsyth Park, tie undone, jacket slung over one shoulder like an afterthought. A jazz trio had colonized the park's bandstand, trumpet, upright bass, and a washboard percussionist wearing mirrored sunglasses despite the hour. A semicircle of onlookers swayed beneath the live oak canopy, Spanish moss glowing silver in the street lamps. Thaddeus paused at the fringe, tapping a surgeon's precise rhythm against his thigh, until a flicker of motion to his right diverted his attention. Under a colonnade of magnolias, a woman was painting directly onto the stiff, glossy surface of a pharma sponsor poster she had pried from a lamppost. She worked with a stub of charcoal first, roughing out circles that overlapped like eclipse phases, then layered cadmium yellows and ochres from a travel palette. The poster's original slogan, Vitruvia Pharma, Engineering Tomorrow's Cure, was rapidly disappearing beneath a field of luminous sunflowers, petals exploding outward as if trying to escape the corporate tagline. Thaddeus, whose life was ruled by data, efficiency metrics, and the sterile glow of cath lab monitors, felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest, delight unalloyed by utility. He stepped closer. Up close the woman smelled faintly of turpentine and orange blossom. A single auburn curl had escaped her head scarf, trailing paint across her cheek like a careless signature. "Sunflowers over marketing copy," he said, careful not to startle her. "A statistically superior improvement." She laughed without looking up. "Statistics are for people counting outcomes. I'm counting revolutions, one poster at a time." Her voice carried a husky coastal drawl, like low tide receding over shells. He extended a hand automatically, the way he greeted visiting surgeons. "Thaddeus Crane." At that she did look up, amber-brown eyes catching lamplight. "I know who you are, Dr. Crane. I sketched through your entire keynote." She wiped her palm on a paint-stained rag before shaking his. "Marigold Blythe. Field microbiologist and part-time vandal." He raised an eyebrow. "I thought field microbiologists spent their evenings culturing samples, not defacing billboards." "I consider this an act of decontamination," she said, applying a final streak of white to a sunflower's rim. "Vitruvia's pesticide trials wiped out 3 pollinator colonies last year. If their PR team wants to plaster the city with promises of tomorrow, the least I can do is give the bees a memorial tonight." The moral clarity in her tone disarmed him more than any flirtation could have. "I'm familiar with Vitruvia's less publicized studies," he admitted. "One reason Heartworks never accepted their funding." She snapped the cap onto her paint pen, skepticism flitting across her features. "A billionaire surgeon with an ethical spine. That would be a first-in-class therapy." He almost laughed, almost. "Careful. My ego responds poorly to irony. Mine feeds on it." She slid her supplies into a canvas satchel splattered like a Pollock reject. "Buy me a Sazerac, Dr. Crane, and we'll test your tolerance." They crossed Gaston Street to an after-hours bar tucked behind wrought iron gates. Inside, Edison bulbs floated above a marble counter, and a ceiling fan stirred air perfumed with rye, peychaud's, and distant gardenia. Over cocktails she asked why his conference badge listed no corporate sponsors. He confessed that private equity already called him reckless for sinking profits into subsidized pediatric surgeries. Accepting big pharma's money felt like mortgaging his conscience. She countered with tales of tracing cholera outbreaks along the Gulf Coast, only to watch municipal budgets dry up before filtration systems could be installed. Conversation ricocheted from bioethics to Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, from the aerodynamics of swallowtail butterflies to whether time was better measured in heartbeats or brushstrokes. With each topic the tight coil inside Thaddeus loosened, threads of tension unspooling in ways no meditation app had managed. At last call the bartender set 2 souvenir napkins on the counter, thick linen squares stamped with the bar's crest. Marigold snatched one and, with a charcoal stub, sketched a sunflower whose center spiraled into the shape of a human heart, ventricles morphing into seeds. She slid it across to him. "For when the metrics blur," she said. "A reminder that hearts are also flowers if you zoom out far enough." He traced the drawing's contour, surprised to feel his pulse hammer. "Come to the DeSoto. I promise I won't pitch you a venture." She held his gaze for a count of 3, long enough to confirm mutual consent, short enough to keep the night's tempo, and nodded. Up in his suite, the distant river smell mingled with the citrus on her skin. They undressed without urgency, as if each layer removed was a clause struck from a lifetime of NDAs. When he kissed the freckles on her collarbone, she whispered that freckles were just cartographic symbols for places she'd survived. He answered by mapping new constellations with his lips. They made love twice, the first time a wildfire, the second a slow burn that ended with their foreheads touching, breath synced like arrhythmic metronomes finally finding the beat. Sleep claimed them in a tangle of sheets and paint-speckled fingers. Gray dawn seeped through gauzy curtains. A tugboat's horn groaned on the Savannah River. Thaddeus reached across the mattress for her warmth and found only cool linen. On the pillow lay the sunflower napkin, now signed him, Blythe in tiny script beneath the stem. No phone number, no forwarding address. Just a single line added below the heart-shaped corolla. Some seeds wait for fire before they open. He dressed mechanically, every motion practiced yet hollow. The napkin he folded with surgical precision and slid into the leather folio that held his lecture notes. Then, because his flight to Atlanta would not wait, he locked the folio inside the room's safe, as if burying a live wire he dared not touch again. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with departing delegates, all of them strangers. He joined their current, outwardly indistinguishable, save for the sudden knowledge that beneath his ribs something had cracked open, scattering seeds he could neither quantify nor retrieve. 5 years blurred past like scenery outside a bullet train, each season stamped by expansion milestones for Cranialis Heartworks, a neonatal valve lab in Minneapolis, a robotics fellowship in Kyoto, a satellite clinic aboard a refitted hospital ship patrolling the Gulf. Thaddeus measured the interval not in revenue graphs but in the slow ossification of a private ritual. On the first day of every month, before dawn rounds, he opened the wall safe in his midtown Atlanta penthouse, unfolded the sunflower napkin, and stared at the charcoal-penciled heart until its spiral seemed to pulse. Then he refolded along the same creases, restoring the artifact to hibernation. He never tried to find Marigold Blythe, rationalizing that people who vanished so completely must need the invisibility more than he needed closure, but the napkin's edges grew soft from handling, as if absorbing the skin oils of unspoken questions. On an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in late April, the ritual was interrupted by chaos in the outpatient atrium of Heartworks Children's. A flash flood of parents surged around the registration desk, clutching triage tickets for the Foundation's annual pro bono genetic screening. Thaddeus had originally planned to attend only the opening ceremony, cut the ribbon, shake hands with donors, but the sheer kinetic energy of anxious families pulled him deeper into the flow. He shrugged into a white coat, scanned the day's roster, and began triaging alongside the fellows. By mid-morning he was 3 patients behind schedule when a nurse wheeled in a slight boy whose pallor was made starker by a shock of ink-black hair. The child's medical chart flagged chronic infections, poor wound healing, and weight in the 7th percentile. But none of that hijacked Thaddeus's attention as forcefully as the boy's eyes, the right iris a flinty gray, the left a vivid green. Heterochromia was rare but hardly unheard of. What made his scalp prickle was the exact match to his own asymmetric gaze, a quirk so distinctive that colleagues joked it was the easiest way to verify his identity during masked surgeries. "Good morning, young man," Thaddeus said, voice pitched to the register that calmed jittery toddlers before anesthesia. "I'm Dr. Crane. What's your name?" The boy's reply came after a brief, assessing stare. "Fenwick," he said, pronouncing each syllable as if reading from a dictionary. But my mom calls me fun. May I ask how old you are, Fenwick? 7¾ he answered, holding up 8 fingers, then reconsidering and folding one down. My birthday is August 12th. I'll be 8 in 4 months. August 12th. The date detonated in Thaddeus's mind like a ruptured aneurysm. He counted backward with a surgeon's instinct for timing, 9 months minus a handful of days from the night in Savannah. His hand, steady even during aortic dissections, quivered as he palpated the boy's lymph nodes. Fenwick endured the exam with stoic curiosity, glancing only once at the physician's mismatched eyes as though noting a mirror anomaly. While a phlebotomist coaxed blood from Fenwick's thin arm, Thaddeus stepped into the corridor to inhale a stabilizing lungful of antiseptic-scented air. The intake form listed the policyholder of record as Sunward Hope Foundation. Under parental information, mother, Marigold Blythe. Father, not applicable. No phone number, only a Savannah post office box. He returned to find Fenwick examining a reflex hammer like a museum artifact. Does your mother know you're here today? Thaddeus asked. She sent me with Ms. Ilari, Fenwick replied, nodding toward the waiting room window where a tall woman in her 20s scrolled through a tablet. Mom's in Alabama testing wells. Ilari Laurel, Thaddeus recognized the name from Foundation emails, was a newly hired community health liaison. He thanked Fenwick for his bravery, promised a popsicle after the labs, and beckoned Ilari into a consultation alcove. She's on a field assignment, Ilari explained, lowering her voice. Some rural county with a rotavirus spike. She begged me to make sure Fen got into today's screening because the waitlist was insane. How long have you worked with Ms. Blythe? 6 months. She founded Sunward Hope, but she hates titles. Calls herself a troubleshooter with test tubes. Why? Thaddeus's throat constricted around the reasons he could not disclose. Fenwick's immune profile is concerning, he said instead. We'll need his mother's consent for an advanced protocol. Ilari frowned. Cell reception spotty where she is. Email might reach her sooner than a call. Send both, he said. Flag it urgent. He retreated to his office, a glass cube cantilevered over the atrium like a command deck. With the door shut, the clamor below faded to a muffled tide. He tapped his biometric ID to unlock the safe, withdrew the sunflower napkin, and spread it beneath the desk lamp. The charcoal lines were smudged by time, but the signature remained, M. Blythe. He felt absurd verifying what his marrow already knew, yet the visual confirmation triggered a vertiginous mix of dread and awe. A chime announced an incoming video call. The screen displayed Ilari's number, but when he answered, Marigold's face filled the frame, wind-blown hair escaping a bandana, safety goggles perched on her forehead, background oscillating with the clatter of a water-testing rig. Dr. Crane, she said, tone cautious but not surprised. Ilari tells me Fenwick's blood work lit up your dashboard. He searched her expression for anger, apology, anything that might anchor the moment. All he found was urgency. He needs further immunological sequencing, Thaddeus said, professional cadence automatically engaging. There's a CRISPR-guided therapy in phase 2 that could save the lecture, she cut in gently. I've read the preprints. What do you need from me? Your presence, he blurted, then steadied his voice. And your consent. A beat of silence pulsed between them. Rain pattered on her end, darkening her bandana to rust. Fenwick's life comes first, she said. Send the forms. I'll sign them en route. I'll dispatch a company jet. No, she interrupted. I'll drive. Planes and cell towers don't mix out here. I'll be there tomorrow. Before he could argue, the call ended. The office light seemed suddenly too bright, the air too thin. Thaddeus folded the napkin with exaggerated care, as though creasing new sutures. He had less than 24 hours to design a treatment plan, brief his ethics board, and prepare himself to face the woman who had ghosted his meticulously ordered life, leaving behind a living echo with mismatched eyes. Yet beneath the tidal wave of logistical calculations, a quieter realization swelled. The cracked seed he'd buried 5 years ago had sprouted in the dark, roots threading through every layer of his existence. Tomorrow, when Marigold Blythe walked back into his orbit, the growth would breach the surface, demanding light, and there would be no resealing the soil. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Thaddeus Crane stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the city below shift from the quiet pre-dawn hum to the frantic buzz of morning. He hadn't slept. How could he, after the night's conversation? The image of Marigold's face on the video call lingered in his mind, even as he tried to focus on the day ahead. The napkin, now tucked securely back in the safe, still felt like it had left a part of itself with him. Her voice had been steady, but something in the way she said, "Fenwick's life comes first," had struck him harder than it should have. It was the same thing she'd said years ago when they first met, just before she disappeared. "There's no room for me in your world, Thaddeus. I can't live in the margins of your empire." Those words echoed in his mind now, as clear as if she'd said them yesterday. He snapped out of his reverie, turning away from the glass and focusing on the desk before him. A series of patient files, lab reports, and a mountain of correspondence had piled up since his return from the conference in Savannah, but none of it mattered. His thoughts kept drifting back to Fenwick, his eyes, his health, the fact that the boy was sitting in the clinic's waiting room, a mirror image of the genetic anomaly Thaddeus had long tried to forget. He picked up the phone, his hand lingering above the receiver. He should call Ilari to check on Fenwick's progress, confirm the test results, but that felt secondary now. Instead, he dialed the private number for Marigold's assistant, a woman named Carla who had been with Marigold since her fieldwork days. The phone rang twice before Carla picked up, her voice tight but professional. "Dr. Crane," Carla answered, her tone indicating she already knew what this was about. "I'm assuming this is regarding Fenwick?" Thaddeus hesitated, then said, "Yes." "Is she on her way?" There was a long pause before Carla spoke again. "She's on the road, but I don't know how much help she'll be, Dr. Crane. She's been through a lot. The isolation, the work. She's not the same person she was 5 years ago. You need to prepare for that." Thaddeus's stomach tightened, a lump rising in his throat. He had already prepared for the fact that Marigold had changed, that their past was something irretrievable. But Carla's words stung more than expected. "I'll prepare," he said, his voice much quieter than he intended. "Just remember, Marigold does things on her own terms. She doesn't play by the rules anymore." Thaddeus set the phone down, his fingers trembling slightly as he rubbed his temples. He didn't want to admit it, but Carla was right. He had been running a company, a machine that turned problems into numbers and solutions into profits. Marigold, however, had always worked on a different scale. She measured lives, real human beings, not through spreadsheets but through the everyday grit of survival, the dirt under the fingernails of fieldwork. And that was the part of her that had haunted him, even when he tried to bury it under his perfect, efficient life. He hadn't expected it to be like this, the pull between the life he had built for himself and the one that Marigold had led. The one that she now needed to share with him, if only for Fenwick's sake. Thaddeus snapped out of his thoughts again, focusing on the task at hand. There were decisions to be made, lives to save. He had never wavered when it came to his medical practice, but this was something new. This was not just a case, this was personal. He picked up the phone again, dialing Ilari. "I need you to get the full test results for Fenwick and send them directly to my office," Thaddeus said, cutting straight to the point. "And get a list of his medications, any experimental treatments he's been on. I need to know everything." "Of course, Dr. Crane. We've already started the tests for the new protocol," Ilari replied, her voice steady, yet tinged with the same worry he had heard in Carla's earlier. "But the labs, well, they're showing a higher rate of autoimmunity than we expected. The condition is worse than we thought." Thaddeus felt a cold spike of alarm shoot through him. "Get me the preliminary report." I'll be in the clinic in 20 minutes. The phone call ended, and for a moment, Thaddeus simply stood there, caught between the future of his clinic and the unexpected past that had come crashing into his present. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut, the kind he hadn't experienced since the early days of his medical career, when every diagnosis felt like a life-or-death gamble. But this was different. This was personal. Fenwick wasn't just another patient. Fenwick was his. By the time Thaddeus arrived at the clinic, his mind was a blur of clinical data, projections, and a deeply buried anxiety he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. He was used to holding himself together in emergencies, but this was not just an emergency. This was something that forced him to confront a past he had carefully compartmentalized. Marigold had vanished, but her legacy, her son, was now part of his world again, and he had no idea how to navigate this strange new reality. Ilari greeted him in the hallway, her expression grim as she led him to Fenwick's room. The boy was sitting on a chair, swinging his legs, his green and gray eyes locked on the window, unfazed by the adults hovering around him. He looked smaller in person, fragile in a way that the medical charts had not captured. Thaddeus crouched down in front of him, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Fenwick," he said softly, "I need to take a look at your test results. Is that all right with you?" Fenwick gave him a small nod, the corners of his lips lifting just slightly. "I like your eyes," he said, voice calm and steady for someone so young. Thaddeus's heart twisted in his chest. "I like yours too," he said quietly, meeting the boy's gaze. Ilari stepped forward, handing Thaddeus the report. He scanned it quickly, his heart sinking with every new line. The autoimmunity markers were off the charts, and Fenwick's immune system was not only underdeveloped but actively attacking his body. There was no simple treatment for this, no easy answer. It was as if every cell in the boy's body was at war with itself. Thaddeus looked at Fenwick again, struggling to push the surge of guilt that was rising in his throat. This wasn't just a child in need of a miracle. This was his child too, whether he was ready to admit it or not. And what had he done? He had spent 5 years working on building a legacy that was now tainted by his own choices. He had ignored the consequences, buried the part of him that had wanted to be more than just a successful surgeon or businessman. And now, that choice was staring him in the face. The door opened, and Marigold stepped into the room, her presence more commanding than anything he had anticipated. The years had etched new lines into her face, but her eyes were still the same, sharp, guarded, and full of the same fire that had always drawn him in. She looked at him, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, recognition, confusion, maybe even a trace of longing. Thaddeus stood, his body stiffening. "Marigold," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Crane," she replied, her tone just as formal as it had been the last time they spoke, 5 years ago. "I see you've met Fenwick." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His gaze moved from her to the boy, and back to her again. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect him." Marigold's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't expect you to be the one saving him, Thaddeus." And just like that, the floodgates opened, the years of silence, the anger, the regret. But underneath it all, something deeper lingered, something that neither time nor distance had erased. And in that moment, he realized that the question of who would save whom had never been as simple as it appeared. They were both standing on the precipice of a new beginning, and this time, there would be no turning away. Marigold's arrival in the clinic had been the catalyst Thaddeus hadn't known he needed. Despite the awkwardness of their first exchange in years, there was a tension between them now, one that felt like an anchor, pulling them into a shared past that neither had been able to escape. Marigold had always been a force of nature, unyielding in her resolve, and yet there was something vulnerable about her now, a kind of quiet weariness that seeped through the sharpness of her gaze. It unnerved him, even as it pulled at something buried deep within him, something he had thought was long gone. She was standing near Fenwick's bed now, her back to Thaddeus as she adjusted the blankets, smoothing out the creases with meticulous care. He could tell she was trying to appear unaffected, but there was an unmistakable tension in the way her fingers moved, betraying the nervous energy she hadn't fully shed. "I didn't expect to see you here, Thaddeus," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something more complicated. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his arms folded across his chest. The room felt smaller with her in it, as if their shared history had redefined the space between them. "You always knew I was going to be here," he replied quietly, his voice betraying none of the storm that churned beneath the surface. "This isn't about me, though. It's about Fenwick." Her shoulders stiffened at the mention of their son, but she didn't turn around to face him. "I didn't ask for your help, Thaddeus. You're here because you care about fixing problems, not because you care about what happens to him." His breath caught in his throat. There was so much truth in her words, too much for him to deny. It had always been easier to fix things, to play the part of the detached surgeon, the businessman who made decisions based on data and efficiency, rather than on emotion. It had always been easier to compartmentalize his feelings for her, to keep his distance from a woman who had once threatened to undo everything he had worked for. But now, in the cold light of the clinic, surrounded by the sterile walls of the hospital, that detachment felt hollow. "I'm not here to fix anything, Marigold," Thaddeus said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I'm here because I don't know how to fix this, but I know I can't let you do this alone." There was a long silence between them, the hum of the fluorescent lights above filling the void. Finally, Marigold turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, once so full of fire and resolve, seemed distant now, as if the years had worn them down, erasing the intensity that had once defined her. And yet, despite the exhaustion that lingered in her gaze, there was a fierceness in her stance, a quiet strength that Thaddeus had always admired. "You don't get it," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't want him to be a part of this world. I didn't want him to be a part of your world." Thaddeus's heart sank at her words. He had always known that Marigold had distanced herself from him for reasons that ran deeper than just their differing careers. She had never believed in the life he had built for himself, in the machine he had created to drive his success. He had thought, in the naivete of his ambition, that he could convince her otherwise. But now, standing before her in this sterile hospital room, he understood the gravity of her decision. She hadn't left because she didn't love him. She had left because she had seen the cost of that love, the way it would consume them both. "I never wanted to be the reason you couldn't be yourself," Thaddeus said quietly. "But I didn't understand, back then. I didn't see how much I was asking you to sacrifice." Marigold took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "You couldn't see it because you didn't want to. You thought if you worked hard enough, if you made enough money, you could change the world. You never once thought about the people who would get lost along the way. And I couldn't be one of them, Thaddeus. I couldn't live my life as another casualty of your ambition." Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, he was frozen. The cold realization that he had failed her, that he had failed them both, swept over him with a force he couldn't escape. The guilt was suffocating, and the weight of his own decisions pressed down on his chest. "I never wanted you to feel like that," he whispered. "I never wanted to be the kind of person who made you feel small or invisible." Marigold's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a distance between them that neither of them seemed able to close. "You didn't know how to be anything else. And I didn't know how to wait for you to see it." The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. They had both spent years running from this moment, pretending that time had healed the wounds that had torn them apart. But now, in the sterile silence of the clinic, with Fenwick asleep in the bed between them, they were forced to confront the reality of what they had lost, and what they still had. "I don't know what to do now, Thaddeus," Marigold said, her voice small, almost defeated. "I'm doing everything I can for him, but the more I fight, the more I feel like I'm failing." Thaddeus stepped closer to her, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her arm. "You're not failing. You're doing everything you can. And I'm here now. We're here. Together, we can figure this out." Marigold looked at him, her gaze searching his face as if looking for some hint of the man she had once known. And for a fleeting moment, Thaddeus saw a flicker of the woman she used to be, the one who had never asked for anything but had given him everything. She was still there, beneath the layers of time and pain, and the realization made his chest ache. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were," Marigold said quietly, her voice laced with a kind of painful honesty. "But for him, for Fenwick, we need to try." Thaddeus nodded, the weight of the words settling over him like a heavy blanket. They couldn't undo the past. But for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of something new. Something different. For Fenwick, for Marigold, and for himself. "Then we'll try," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll try together." And as he stood there, beside Marigold, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the blinds, Thaddeus felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. And for the first time, he believed that it might be enough to guide them forward. The journey ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in years, it felt like it was worth the fight. The following days stretched out before Thaddeus like a tightrope suspended between two worlds. His professional life, which had always been a series of clean, defined steps toward an ever-expanding horizon, now felt like it was collapsing in on itself. There was no more room for calculated detachment, no more space to just bury his emotions in numbers or business deals. Fenwick's condition demanded his full attention, and with it came the unavoidable proximity to Marigold, a proximity that was as electrifying as it was painful. He spent most of his time in the clinic, overseeing the tests and monitoring Fenwick's progress, but every time he stepped out of the sterile world of patient care, his mind returned to the lingering tension between him and Marigold. They hadn't spoken much since their heart-to-heart in Fenwick's room, both of them navigating the fragile, unspoken truce they had struck. They shared a singular goal now: to save Fenwick. But everything else between them, everything they had been before, everything they had lost, hung in the balance like an unsolved riddle, one that neither of them had the courage to address directly. The clinic's sterile, white walls felt suffocating now, a constant reminder of the dissonance between the life he had built and the life he had abandoned. As much as Thaddeus tried to focus on the science, the endless charts, the experimental protocols, the potential treatments, his mind would always return to Marigold. She was everywhere, in the decisions he made for Fenwick's care, in the way he approached each new piece of data with both hope and trepidation. She was there, lurking at the periphery of every thought. And then, there was Fenwick, his son, though they had never used that word. Thaddeus wasn't sure if he was ready to embrace it, but the truth had started to sink in. The mismatched eyes, the small features that mirrored his own in strange, uncanny ways, it was undeniable. Fenwick was his, in ways that went far beyond biology. One evening, a week after Marigold's arrival, Thaddeus found himself alone in the clinic after hours, standing in the same lab where they'd run Fenwick's tests. The data was coming in faster than they could process it, and every report made Thaddeus' stomach tighten further. There was no quick fix for what Fenwick was going through. The boy's immune system was attacking his own body, and the new CRISPR-based treatment Thaddeus had hoped would save him was still in its early, experimental phases. There were risks, there were side effects. This was uncharted territory. But as he stared at the screen, watching the numbers flicker in front of him, Thaddeus knew there was only one option left: he had to push forward, even if the outcome was uncertain. The sharp clack of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Marigold appeared at the door, her silhouette framed by the faint light from the corridor. She was wearing a faded blue sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, as if she had just come from the field. She looked the same, strong, determined, yet there was an unmistakable fatigue in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been carrying for years now visible on her face. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as though she had been gathering the courage to speak for some time. "How's he doing?" Thaddeus didn't turn immediately, his gaze fixed on the monitor, the numbers swimming before his eyes. The truth was, he didn't know how to answer her. He had spent so much time immersed in the clinical data, the numbers that never lied, but here, in this room, in this fragile space between them, words seemed inadequate. "He's not getting worse," he said finally, his voice low. "But he's not getting better, either." Marigold took a step into the room, her eyes scanning the data on the screen. "What's the prognosis?" Thaddeus exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers against his temples. "There's a chance, only a chance, that the CRISPR treatment could work. But it's experimental, and it comes with risks. Even if it works, we'll have to watch him very closely. It's going to be a long road, Marigold. A very long road." She nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. Thaddeus could see the wheels turning in her mind, the same analytical focus that had drawn him to her all those years ago. But even then, there was something else in her expression now, something deeper, something softer. "And what about you?" she asked after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. Thaddeus looked at her then, really looked at her. The walls between them seemed thinner now, the years of separation and misunderstanding fading into the background. For the first time since she had returned, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the years they had spent apart, the pieces of their past that had remained unaddressed. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew what she was getting at. It wasn't about Fenwick anymore, it was about them. Marigold's gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. "How are you handling this? This whole situation?" "Fenwick, me. I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to do here, Thaddeus. Are you trying to fix this, or are you just trying to fix him?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so long focusing on the solution, on the science, that he hadn't stopped to think about what this meant for him personally. He had been so consumed by the need to solve problems, to prove that he could save the day, that he hadn't really asked himself if he was doing this for the right reasons. He took a deep breath, turning away from the monitor, finally allowing himself to face her fully. "I don't know," he admitted, the words heavier than they should have been. "I don't know how to fix any of this, Marigold. I don't know if I'm doing this for him, or for you, or for us." The air between them seemed to shift, the weight of his admission hanging in the space between them. Marigold studied him for a moment, and he could see the sadness in her eyes, but there was also something else, a flicker of something that resembled understanding. "I'm not asking for answers, Thaddeus," she said softly. "I'm not asking you to fix everything. But I need to know that you're here for him, for us, not just for the treatment or for the clinic. I need to know that you're here for the right reasons." He nodded slowly, the words catching in his throat. "I'm here," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm here for all of it, Marigold. I'm here for you, and for Fenwick. And for whatever comes next." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their unspoken understanding settled over them, and Thaddeus felt the walls between them begin to crumble, slowly, but unmistakably. He didn't have the answers, and he couldn't promise everything would be okay. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was in the right place, standing here, with her, and with the son he hadn't known existed. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "But I'm here. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Fenwick has a chance." Marigold's eyes met his, her gaze softening. "That's all I need to hear." And in that moment, something shifted between them, something fragile, but real. It wasn't the resolution of all their past conflicts, but it was a start. A start that, maybe, could lead to something better, for Fenwick, for them, and for the future they could still build, piece by piece. The days following the conversation in the clinic were a blur of tests, treatments, and late-night meetings. Thaddeus had thrown himself into work with the single-minded obsession that had always defined him, but this time it felt different. Every decision he made, every line of data he reviewed, was now tied to a life, Fenwick's life, and in a strange way, it was also tied to Marigold. The weight of it was overwhelming, and yet there was a quiet determination building within him. He had spent his life diagnosing problems, finding solutions, but now, the problem wasn't just a malfunctioning valve or a rogue protein. It was a child. It was his son. Fenwick's condition was complicated, far more so than Thaddeus had anticipated. The CRISPR-based treatment he had hoped would work was still in its early stages, and despite promising results in animal trials, there was no guarantee it would work in humans. Thaddeus had always prided himself on his clinical certainty, but here, with Fenwick, uncertainty was a constant companion. Every time he looked at the boy's eyes, mismatched and so painfully familiar, he was reminded that there was so much more at stake than just the science. This was personal. It wasn't just the science, though. The presence of Marigold, her quiet resolve, her unwavering commitment to Fenwick, had brought something out of Thaddeus that he hadn't expected. For years, he had buried his emotions under the weight of his professional life, letting his ambitions guide him. But now, standing at the crossroads of his past and present, he was confronted with the truth. He could no longer ignore the cost of his choices. The life he had built had come at the expense of everything else, his relationship with Marigold, his connection to the people who truly mattered. Despite the tension between them, Marigold's return had forced him to confront the past in a way he hadn't been ready for. She hadn't asked for his help. She hadn't needed him then, and she didn't need him now. But Fenwick did. And that, more than anything, made Thaddeus realize how much he had to lose if he didn't step up. He couldn't fix everything, he knew that now, but he could try. He could do the one thing that had always eluded him, make a choice that wasn't driven by success or reputation but by something deeper. Something that had always been there, buried beneath layers of ambition. Love. The day Marigold had arrived at the clinic, Thaddeus had felt a shift in the air, a quiet tension that seemed to settle around them both. It had been the first time in years that they were in the same space, forced to confront the past, forced to acknowledge the unspoken things between them. Since then, there had been no easy answers, no neatly tied-up resolutions. Just the uncomfortable reality of being in the same room, navigating the strange, fragile space that had formed between them. The following week, Marigold had insisted on staying at the clinic. She didn't have a permanent home base anymore, too many years spent moving from one assignment to the next. But here, in Atlanta, with Fenwick in need of constant monitoring and treatment, she had nowhere else to go. She didn't ask Thaddeus for help with lodging, but it was clear that her usual self-sufficiency wasn't going to be enough this time. Thaddeus offered a guest room in his penthouse, not out of charity, but because he knew she wouldn't accept anything else. The offer had come as a surprise to both of them, but neither had said anything more about it. There was no point in pretending like they hadn't already crossed a line. That night, after the last of the evening's tests had been completed and the clinic was quiet, Thaddeus found himself standing in the kitchen of his apartment, trying to prepare something for dinner. It felt strange, like trying to cook for a stranger in his own home. Marigold had refused the offer to eat with him earlier, preferring to spend the evening with Fenwick, who was still struggling to adjust to the medications and treatments. But now, as the night stretched on, she came into the kitchen, her steps soft against the polished hardwood floors. "I don't know how you do it," Marigold said quietly, watching him chop vegetables with a precision that matched his surgical skill. He glanced up at her, the familiar warmth in her voice cutting through the tension that had been simmering between them. "Do what?" "Make everything look so easy," she replied, folding her arms over her chest. "I've been watching you, Thaddeus. You move through this whole world like you own it. You've built something huge. But I don't think you even know how to stop sometimes. You never did." He stopped mid-chop, the knife hovering over the cutting board as he turned to face her. "You think I don't know how to stop?" "I think you've convinced yourself you can't," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "It's easier to keep moving forward, to keep building, to keep fixing things. But what happens when the things you're fixing aren't enough? When the lives you're trying to save can't be saved?" Her words stung more than he expected. He set the knife down slowly, his hands suddenly feeling heavy. "I'm not doing this for me, Marigold. I'm doing this for Fenwick. For you." She shook her head, her eyes glinting with something that was equal parts frustration and sorrow. "That's the problem, Thaddeus. You think you can fix things by just working harder, by just doing more. But you're not seeing the bigger picture. It's not just about fixing Fenwick. It's about understanding why we're in this situation in the first place." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had never been good at hearing the hard truths, especially from her. But there was no denying the validity of her words. She was right. He had been running from the truth for too long. He had been running from the very thing that had always mattered most. "Tell me what I'm missing," he said, his voice softer now. "Tell me how to do this differently." Marigold's gaze softened for a moment, her arms unfolding as she stepped closer to him. "You have to stop seeing this as something you can fix on your own. You have to stop trying to control everything. Fenwick needs more than a doctor, Thaddeus. He needs his parents. He needs us." The words landed heavily between them, like a stone dropped into a still pond. For the first time in a long time, Thaddeus felt something inside him shift. He had spent so much of his life focused on control, on precision, on fixing things that he hadn't realized how much he had been neglecting. He had been neglecting them, Marigold, Fenwick, the very people who mattered most. "I'm not sure I know how to be that person, Marigold," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long being the doctor, the businessman. I've forgotten how to be a father. How to be someone's partner." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. "You're not perfect, Thaddeus. And neither am I. But we can figure this out. Together." The weight of her words hung in the air as he looked at her, really looked at her. The years had changed them both, but in that moment, standing in his kitchen with the world outside still uncertain, he felt something fragile stir between them. Something that was still real. "I don't know what this will look like," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm willing to try. For Fenwick. For us." She smiled, a small but genuine expression that softened the tension in the room. "That's all I'm asking for." And for the first time in years, Thaddeus felt like he had a chance, like he could rebuild what had been lost, not through surgery or data or scientific breakthroughs, but through something that couldn't be measured. Something that was just as important, if not more so, love. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure this out. Together." And in that moment, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be great, but Thaddeus finally understood that he didn't have to face them alone. The next few weeks felt like a blur. The intensity of Fenwick's condition had forced Thaddeus and Marigold to form a partnership that was both fragile and urgent. Every decision, every test, every late-night meeting was weighted with the gravity of their son's life. But as much as Thaddeus tried to focus on the science, there was always a part of him that couldn't escape the emotional complexity of it all. He and Marigold had been forced to confront their past, their mistakes, and the complicated web of their relationship. Yet, amidst it all, they had one common goal, Fenwick's survival. They spent countless hours in the clinic, with Thaddeus running the most advanced tests and protocols, while Marigold managed the logistics and monitored Fenwick's progress. The boy's health was unstable, the CRISPR-based treatment still in its infancy, and every day brought new data that seemed to only raise more questions. Fenwick's body was responding, but not as quickly as they had hoped. The autoimmunity markers that Thaddeus had feared were still elevated, and Fenwick's immune system was, at best, in a precarious balance. His body was fighting itself, struggling to accept the new treatment, and it seemed as though no matter what they did, the road to recovery was not going to be a straight line. Thaddeus had always prided himself on his ability to fix things, to diagnose, treat, and heal. But this time, the task at hand was so much more than that. It wasn't just a clinical problem to be solved. It was personal. This was his son. He couldn't simply apply the logic of his medical training and hope for the best. Fenwick wasn't just another patient in the long line of cases he had dealt with. He was family, and that made everything infinitely more complicated. The nights were the hardest. When the clinic emptied and the lights dimmed, Thaddeus would retreat to his office, his mind swirling with thoughts of what else could be done. The only thing that kept him going was the quiet presence of Marigold. She had become a steady force in the chaos, organizing the treatments, running the tests, and doing everything she could to help Fenwick. Yet even with her expertise, even with her unwavering commitment to her son, there was something in the air between them. It was as if the past was still a specter, haunting their every interaction, even as they worked together toward a shared goal. One evening, after a particularly grueling round of tests, Thaddeus found himself sitting in the break room with Marigold. She was drinking her usual tea, and he had a glass of bourbon in front of him, though he hadn't taken a sip yet. They had spent the day combing through data, trying to find something, anything, that could explain Fenwick's slow progress, but the answers were still elusive. There was nothing more they could do but wait. Marigold leaned back in her chair, her tired eyes fixed on the floor. "I never imagined it would be like this," she said quietly, almost to herself. Thaddeus glanced at her, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "How did you imagine it would be?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. "I don't know," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I guess I thought we could fix it, you know. Just like everything else. But this is different. I can't fix him, Thaddeus. I can't make it go away. I can't control what happens to him." The rawness in her voice hit Thaddeus harder than he expected. He had always known Marigold to be strong, resolute in her beliefs and actions, but now she sounded vulnerable. It was the first time he had seen her so open, so unguarded, and it stirred something inside him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For all of his professional detachment, for all his ability to separate emotion from decision, he had never stopped caring about her. And seeing her like this, so stripped down, so real, was both a relief and a pain. He set his glass down without drinking, and leaned forward. "You're not alone in this, Marigold," he said softly. "I know it feels like we're just going through the motions, but we're in this together. We'll figure it out." She nodded, but there was something in the way she avoided his gaze that told him she didn't fully believe him. Marigold had always been the one to solve problems, to find the answers. It was hard for her to accept that there were things beyond her control. "I don't know if we can figure this out," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I'm enough for him. For you. For any of this." Thaddeus swallowed hard, his chest tightening at her words. "You are enough. You've always been enough. You've been doing everything, Marigold. Everything. And you've kept him safe. You've kept him alive. That's more than enough." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, Thaddeus saw the cracks in her armor. The fear, the exhaustion, the vulnerability that she had worked so hard to keep hidden. He had always admired her strength, but now, he could see how much it had cost her. How much she had been carrying on her own. "I'm scared, Thaddeus," she whispered. "I'm scared that I'm not doing enough. That I'm failing him." Thaddeus stood then, walking over to her side and placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're not failing him," he said firmly. "And you're not failing me. You're doing everything you can. And that's all we can do." She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other in years. Thaddeus's breath caught in his throat. "I'm here, Marigold," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here for you. For Fenwick. For whatever comes next." For a long moment, they simply sat there, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. The clinic outside was quiet now, the faint hum of machines the only sound breaking the stillness. It was a moment of peace amidst the chaos, a rare break in the storm that had consumed them both. Finally, Marigold spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do this on my own. I've been doing it alone for so long, Thaddeus. I don't know how to let someone in. Thaddeus's heart ached at her words, but he understood. He had spent so much of his life avoiding vulnerability, burying himself in work to avoid the messiness of human connection. But he couldn't do that anymore. Not now, with Fenwick's life hanging in the balance. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly. You've never had to do it alone. Marigold looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Maybe hope. Maybe fear. What if it's too late? It's never too late, Thaddeus said, his voice steady and firm. We'll find a way. Together. And in that moment, something between them shifted. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a beginning. A promise that they wouldn't be doing this alone anymore. That they would face whatever came next, together. Later that night, after the clinic had emptied out and the city outside had quieted down, Thaddeus found himself sitting in the dark, staring out the window at the skyline. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from the lab. The latest round of tests on Fenwick had come back. He felt a flicker of hope. He read the message quickly, scanning the results. There were some positive signs, his immune markers were stabilizing, and the treatment seemed to be having a slight effect. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. Not when there was still a chance. With a deep breath, Thaddeus made the decision. He would fight for Fenwick. He would fight for Marigold. And this time, he wouldn't do it alone. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Thaddeus felt like he was ready to walk it, whatever it took. The weeks that followed felt like a slow march through fog, with each step forward seeming to lead them deeper into uncertainty. Fenwick's condition had stabilized slightly, but there were no guarantees, no clear path to recovery. The treatment, though promising, was still experimental, and every day brought new challenges. Thaddeus had learned to hold his breath between the tests, waiting for the results to come in, each piece of data a small victory or a quiet defeat. But as time passed, something began to shift inside him. He found himself less focused on the science and more on Fenwick, the boy who shared his mismatched eyes, the boy who had brought him back into a world he had long closed off. Marigold had stayed by Fenwick's side, as relentless in her care as she had always been in her work. But even her seemingly unshakable resolve had begun to show cracks. Thaddeus saw it in the way her shoulders slumped slightly when she thought no one was looking, in the soft exhale of breath she let out when she thought Fenwick was asleep. She was tired, and he could see it, though she would never admit it. She had always carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but now, it was clear that the weight was becoming too much to bear alone. It was late one evening when Thaddeus found himself walking down the hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing against the sterile walls. The clinic had emptied out for the night, the staff gone home, but he couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't allow it. The tests on Fenwick's condition had shown slight improvement, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He had seen the flicker of hope in Marigold's eyes when she had learned of the progress, but even she knew the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and fraught with obstacles. He turned the corner and saw Marigold standing by the large window at the end of the hallway, staring out into the night. Her figure was silhouetted against the faint light of the city, her arms crossed over her chest as though trying to hold herself together. She hadn't heard him approach, and for a moment, he simply stood there, watching her. She had always been strong, stronger than anyone he had known, but he knew her better than that. Her strength came from something deeper, something that was both a blessing and a curse. It was her ability to keep moving forward, to never let the weight of the world slow her down. But tonight, he could see that her strength was running out. Thaddeus took a step forward, breaking the silence. Marigold. She didn't turn around right away. The pause that followed was long enough for Thaddeus to wonder if she had heard him at all. But then, finally, she spoke. I used to think I could save everyone, Thaddeus, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the night. I thought I could fix every problem, every person, just by trying hard enough. But now, I don't know anymore. Thaddeus's heart tightened at the sound of her voice. He walked toward her, coming to a stop beside her at the window. The city below them glimmered with lights, a sea of motion and life that felt impossibly far away. Inside the walls of the clinic, it felt as though time had frozen, trapped in the delicate balance between hope and despair. You've been saving people your whole life, Marigold, Thaddeus said gently. You're not alone in this, you know. You don't have to do it all by yourself. She turned to face him then, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was something more in them too. Something he couldn't name. I don't know how to stop, Thaddeus. I don't know how to let go. He stepped closer to her, his gaze softening as he took in the weariness in her features. She was trying so hard to be everything to everyone, trying to hold the world together while quietly falling apart. It wasn't just Fenwick she was trying to save. It was herself, too. You don't have to let go, Thaddeus said, his voice steady. But you don't have to carry this alone, either. She looked up at him, the vulnerability in her eyes raw and unguarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside felt distant, as though they were the only two people left in the universe. I never wanted you to be a part of this, Thaddeus, she said quietly, almost as if confessing a secret. When I left, I thought I could protect you from all this. From the mess I was in. From the mess that is me. Thaddeus's heart clenched at her words, and without thinking, he reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder. Marigold. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't know how to ask for help, Thaddeus. I didn't know how to let you in. And now, with Fenwick, I don't know if I can handle all of it anymore. He moved closer to her, his hand slipping to her arm, guiding her gently toward him. You don't have to handle everything, Marigold. Let me help. Let me be here, for you and for Fenwick. We don't have to fix everything right now. But we can do this together. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, Thaddeus thought she might pull away, that she might retreat into the fortress she had built around herself. But instead, she let out a shaky breath, her hand coming up to cover his, the warmth of her palm pressing against his skin. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, she whispered, her voice breaking. You are, he said, his voice firm. You're stronger than you know. Marigold let out a soft laugh, the sound almost sad. I don't feel strong right now. You don't have to be strong all the time, Thaddeus replied. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be here. With me. With Fenwick. The words seemed to sink in, and for the first time in days, Thaddeus saw something flicker in her eyes, a spark of hope, however small. She wasn't alone in this, not anymore. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the city below them. It was a small moment, quiet and simple, but it was enough. They were finally facing the truth, they didn't have all the answers, and they couldn't fix everything. But they had each other. And in that, there was something they could hold on to. Later that night, Thaddeus sat by Fenwick's bed, watching the boy sleep. The room was dimly lit, the sound of the heart monitor ticking softly in the background. Fenwick's breathing was steady now, a small victory in a sea of uncertainty. Thaddeus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the boy, for the way he had forced him to confront parts of himself that had long been buried. He thought of Marigold, her quiet strength, her vulnerability, and the way she had finally let him in. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, Thaddeus felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for Fenwick, for Marigold, and for himself, Thaddeus was willing to face whatever came next. Together. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all.